Salvete discipuli. Today we're going to discuss the early republic established in 509 BCE, and specifically we're going to talk about what that form of government looked like and some of the offices that we had during the early republic. Before we get into our discussion, some of our I-cans, by the end of this video, you should be able to summarize the events immediately after the republic was created, and that includes knowing the 5 main political offices in their order and what their main responsibilities were. Finally, you should also be able to describe the imperium power that some of these offices had and what that power entailed. So just to review from Latin 1, we've previously discussed that Rome was founded on April 21st, 753 BCE by our first king Romulus after he killed his brother Remus. And this heralded in the monarchy or rule by a single man, a king with absolute power. The monarchy came to an end after Tarquinius Superbus's son violated a noblewoman Lucretia, and Lucretia's 2 closest relatives started a riot and rebellion, resulting in Tarquinius Superbus and his entire family being sent into exile and the end of the monarchy. Now, as it turns out, this wasn't the end of Tarquinius Superbus. He attempted to reinstate the monarchy by allying himself with the Etruscan king Lars Porsena. However, in the end, due to the heroic actions of 3 notable Republican heroes, Lars Porsena wound up signing a peace treaty with Rome, and Tarquinius Superbus never did in fact regain the throne, and thus the Republic was firmly established as the next form of government for our Roman state. The Republic was formed in 509 BCE, and there is no specific date attached to the formation of the Republic. And the Republic is quite different from the monarchy in terms of form of government, because primarily, instead of rule by a single person, various officials were elected and a constitution was finally written to protect the interests and the rights of the Roman citizens. Now, when we talk about the political offices during the early republic, there is something called the Cursus Honorum, or the path of honor, that various men would work their way through in order to gain honor, prestige for themselves and for their family. In the Cursus Honorum, all offices except for the last one, the censor, were elected annually, and only the office of the censor held office for 18 months instead of the typical 12 months. Here we have the 5 offices within the Cursus Honorum, starting with number 1, the quaestor, followed by number 2, the aedile, number 3, the praetor, number 4, the council, and number 5, the censor that we had previously discussed. And remember, you are going to need to know these offices in their order in addition to the responsibilities that each office had. To start with the first office, the office of the quaestor, in the Roman Republic, the quaestor was primarily in charge of finances within the state of Rome itself. And typically, a Roman had to be at least 30 years old before he could gain the office of the quaestor. However, due to a peculiarity of Roman law, typically Roman law favors the wealthy, and so if you were from a noble patrician family, you could actually gain this office at the age of 28. And this is pretty common for all of the offices, that if you came from a noble family, you could take 2 years off of the minimum requirement and gain office that much more quickly. After you fulfilled your duties as the quaestor, that 1-year term, you were then appointed to the Senate, and this is an advisory body in the Roman Republic that we'll discuss a little later in the video. The second office in the Cursus Honorum is the aedile, and the aedile is in charge of the administration of the Roman government, as well as trade or commerce and public works. And what I'm referring to when I say public works, really what I'm talking about are things like building and road maintenance, the maintenance and cleaning of the sewers, as well as the holding and performing of the public games, both the chariot racing in the Circus Maximus, as well as the gladiatorial combats in the Colosseum. Typically, the aedile represented the lower classes. There were specifically 2 aedile who represented the interests of the lower classes, or the plebeians, but there were also two aediles from that higher ranking patrician class as well to equal a total of four aediles. Each of these aediles also had veto power in case one of the aediles was trying to pass a law to the detriment of the people that they served, either the lower classes or the higher classes. The next two offices in the Cursus Honorum have something called imperium, and this is just the Latin word for powers. And before we take a look at what these two offices were that had imperium, we should try to figure out exactly what kind of power it is that they had. Now, those officers who held offices with imperium were typically escorted by people called lictors, which we translate as attendants. And as we can see from this picture, the lictors carried around with them something called fasces, which are bundles of rods. Now, as you can see from the picture, within that bundle of rods is an axe head, which gives us an indication of really what this imperium power was. Our next two offices in the Cursus Honorum had the power to kill, and they could call upon their lictores to make use of the fasces if they needed to carry out a death penalty in the course of their duties. While not a direct comparison, you can almost think of the lictores as akin to the Secret Service members who protect the president, because in the course of fulfilling his duties, if the president's life is threatened, he can call upon the Secret Service to take that type of imperium power, the power to kill, in order to protect the president and the other high-ranking members of the US government. The first office that had imperium power, which is number 3 in our Cursus Honorum, is that of the praetor, or a judge. And the Roman state had a lot of different judges. The praetor is the highest ranking judge, more akin to the judges from our Supreme Court than the local magistrates in our judicial system. Typically, in order to be a praetor, you had to be at least 39 years old. Of course, if you came from that high-ranking family, you'd take 2 years off of that to be 37. And the praetor was attended by a total of 6 lictores. The second office within the Cursus Honorum that had the imperium power to kill is the fourth on our list of the Cursus Honorum, that of the council, or the chief executive. The council is the office within the Cursus Honorum who had the most power. Typically, as a council, you had to be at least 42 years, or 40 if you were a high-ranking patrician, and you would be attended by a total of 12 lictores. Now, as the chief executive of the Roman state, this is much akin to our office of the presidency. The only difference being that there were 2 of them who were elected annually at the same time. And each of these had veto power that they could use against the other, almost as if you had 2 co-presidents at the same time. I want you to imagine for a moment a world in which the United States had 2 presidents, each with veto power at the same time. And depending on who got elected together, their term could either be highly successful with a lot of measures accomplished, or it could be incredibly disorganized and disfranchised. Imagine if our current president, Donald Trump, and his vice president were each a council and acted as co-presidents together. Because they have similar political views, I imagine that they would be able to accomplish quite a bit during their 1-year term as a council. However, if our current president, Donald Trump, and say Hillary Clinton were councils together, I imagine that they would both make use of that veto power to try and block anything that the other tried to accomplish. The first consuls of the Roman Republic were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, those relatives of the high-ranking woman Lucretia, because of their involvement in starting the riot and rebellion that led to the formation of the Republic. Finally, our last office within the Cursus Honorum is that of the censor, and the censor is typically responsible for conducting the census. And this is not just a census of the citizens who had more rights than the other inhabitants of the Roman Empire, but also a list of who was allowed to participate in the proceedings of the Senate as an advisor. And the censor is, of course, the only office within the Cursus Honorum that served for 18 months instead of the traditional 1-year term. The censor is also an office that no longer has imperium. It's only the offices of the praetor and the council that have imperium. But instead, the office of the censor was considered to be a great honor since it was the last office within the Cursus Honorum. So just as a quick recap, there are really 5 offices within the Cursus Honorum: the quaestor, aedile, council, and the censor. The quaestor is in charge of finances, the aedile in charge of public works, the praetor, which is the first office that has imperium power, is a judge. The council is a chief executive similar to our president, but there are 2 of them. And then the censor is responsible for conducting the census. There were a number of other offices within the early republic, and we're going to talk about 2 of them very briefly. The first one being that of the Senate, to which you could participate after you had fulfilled your duties as a quaestor, that first office within the Cursus Honorum. And while there was a Senate during the monarchy, during the Republic, the Senate really gained a lot more power. During both government periods, it was an advisory group. However, during the Republic, it became codified that the Senate had to be consulted on all matters and be able to give their opinion before laws could be passed. They also had a lot of sway in terms of voting for certain types of laws. And it's also the Senate who is in control of foreign finances and foreign policy. So trade between foreign states, not part of the Roman Empire, as well as establishing diplomatic relationships and bestowing citizenship on conquered allies. The other special office that we need to discuss is that of the dictator. This is a very special and temporary office. Unlike all of the other offices in the Cursus Honorum, the office of the dictatorship lasted for an absolute maximum of 6 months. This is also an office that is controlled by one man. The dictator needs to be elected by the Senate, so that's another form of power for the Senate. And if you were elected to be dictator, you would essentially take over the entire government as if you really were reigning singly, such as in the monarchy where there was a reign by a single man. And it's because of this single rule by one man that the office of the dictator was restricted to only 6 months. Ever since the abolishment of the monarchy after Tarquinius Superbus, the Romans truly hated and feared the idea of rule by one man or the idea of rule by a king. And they went out of their way to make sure that there was a system of checks and balances to prevent people from taking power and holding on to that power indefinitely. Cincinnatus, as we'll learn, was our first dictator of the Roman Republic, and in a later video we'll describe his actions. Finally, during the early Republic, our first constitution and our first laws were officially written down. These laws weren't actually written down until 450 and 451 BCE, approximately 60 years into the Republic, but these are the original laws that were finally codified and written down from when Romulus first established his city and the first laws of the city. Typically, as we've already seen a little bit before, the laws of the 12 tables favored the wealthier citizens, those patricians, as compared to the lower class citizens, the plebeian class. And just a couple of examples, tablets 11 and 12 were the ones that were written in 451 BCE. Tablets 1 through 10 were codified and written in 450. They deal very frequently with the theft of property and other property laws. Tablet number 7 is the one that details other types of crimes apart from theft and property, and it's tablet number 4, just drawing your attention to that quickly, that explains the rights of the father, which is where we get a lot of our information about the rights of the pater familias that we described in level 1. There are 2 laws in particular that are important to our year 2 based on our Ecce Romani story, and the first one, hominem mortuum in urbe ne sepelito neve urito, do not bury or burn a dead man in the city. Now this law is referring to the first walls of the earliest Roman city as opposed to the later walls, which are in red here. And it details that after a person dies, they need to be buried or cremated outside of the city. And this is where you will find the various burial grounds or crematoriums of the Roman state. The other law for discussion of Latin too is inter dio vehiculis licet nihil intra urbem portare. During the day, vehicles are allowed to carry nothing inside the city. Once again, referring to only within the confines of this earliest wall. And it doesn't include this entire area of the city of Rome, but it specifically refers to certain parts within this inner city, such as the Roman Forum, which are high pedestrian traffic areas. Because of their high pedestrian traffic, it was codified that vehicles making deliveries needed to do this during the night if they wanted to use horses and wagons to deliver their goods. Elsewise, slaves needed to carry the goods to the storefront, and vehicles could not be used to transport those goods in those pedestrian-only areas. And we do actually see this in a lot of modern cities in Europe even to this day. Disciply, that's all for a discussion about the early Roman Republican government, the offices of the early Republic, and the laws of the 12 Tables. Walete.